The Gentlementor.
Everything's fine.
This is not his first time, Glenn. I promise. It's
my first time today. My first podcast.
First time today.
Glenn, how are you, brother?
A while. I'm good. I'm very good. It's nice to.
Where are you at in the country? You Baltimore? I saw that somewhere and that stuck in my head? Nope. Okay, I'm completely wrong.
I've never lived there. Only visited once. I live in Brooklyn. Yeah, I've been in Brooklyn for like at least 30 years or more, probably.
Is that your original home, or?
I'm from New Jersey.
New Jersey? Where'd you grow up at?
I grew up in North Jersey, mainly in a town called Madison.
Madison, where's that?
That's
you can give me near this, near that.
You know where Morristown is?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay, it's not far from there. It's the Morris County area.
So this is what we do. I don't know if you're familiar with what we do at all. We're a couple of guys who have conversations. I've been following you for a while on Instagram, obviously. I follow you on my other account, which is primarily I follow artists and musicians and stuff like that, because that's what I am. So that's where I do that, and found your stuff and started following. Like I said, and all the press you were getting and the ink you kept putting up, I'm like, well, this is wild. So we never know what anyone's reaction will be to this.
Yeah.
Hey, we're some guys you never heard of from the Midwest. Would you like to come on the internet and talk to us randomly?
But you guys. You're not in the Midwest, are you?
Yes.
Yeah. We're in Missouri.
Whereabouts are you in the Midwest?
Missouri.
Missouri, okay.
Yeah. I'm in Springfield, and he's a little further north in Columbia.
Springfield, Missouri.
Yeah.
Oh, so you're both in Missouri. Oh, okay.
Yeah. We're about 3 hours apart. He lives in the southwest corner of the state, and I live about dead center.
Yeah. See, I know the Midwest because my parents are from there. I used to go out to Iowa and visit relatives.
Oh.
Go into Illinois as well, and I was very charmed by the Midwest as a kid. I really loved it, the farms and all that stuff. I was very much into it.
It's a little slower pace of life here than or on the east or west coast. It's a little bit slower, but we still get people drive slower and and eat slower and eat more.
Yeah, well, it's a completely different world. It's one of those things where it's, for me anyway, very exotic until I was about like 15, by which point I was like, what am I doing around here? And then I didn't much go back, but I did really enjoy it. And the first time I actually saw underground comics was in a head shop in Springfield, Illinois. That's why when you said Springfield,
okay.
That's where my sister lives, Springfield, Illinois.
Yeah, that's where my dad grew up. And there was a head shop there where I saw all these underground comics. And so I was associated with that, seeing them for the first time was being in a head shop. And yeah.
So help me out here, because I'm familiar with comics, but underground comics, what really is what sets them apart?
Well, basically anything and everything can go into an underground comic, and often will. And that's what made them really exciting right from the start, because they weren't going with the usual power fantasies, super heroics, or any of that. And if you know much about the history of comic books, you may know there was a comic book code that got instituted in the mid 50s as a result of horror comics. So with that comic code, comics really got straightened out. Comics were policing their own ranks. And it wasn't until underground comics and a lot of the craziness that accompanied that, the 1960s, that the whole thing just sort of went ape shit. And that's what those comics really were about. They really went crazy, like sex and violence and ultimately very personal work as well. That was the thing. At first, it just seemed like these guys were lunatics trying to take over the asylum. And to an extent they were, but what they were really doing ultimately was telling very personal stories, even sometimes if it was just in their style. But a lot of the time it would be stories about their own lives. And the whole thing of autobiography, as you may have seen it in comics recently, and it's definitely where my work has headed, relates to that era. So that's, I guess what I'd say, underground comics, the doors got blown off of possibility and restriction. So that can be both good and bad, as it turns out, but it's mostly for the good. It's just that artists need to find ways to, do their best work and not just be crazily impulsive at every turn,
So now what sets apart an underground comic from a graphic novel?
Well, I think that's just like the whole graphic novel thing is just. I don't know if you're familiar with my newest book, which is this book called Chartwell Manor, which was about my time in this boarding school and what followed and all my time with that. But that's essentially an underground comic because
But it's like, and I am familiar with it, and it's like 200 and something pages long, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's a graphic novel.
Okay. Okay.
The only real difference between a comic book and a graphic novel, I guess you could say, is page count.
Okay.
But you're really dealing with a different animal just in terms of what you can have go on. You can really open a story up and you can really bring in elements of time in a way that you really can't with, like, say, a 2-page comic, or a 10-page comic or something like that. So it widens the scope a lot. It's the difference between an animated cartoon that you watch, you know, with Bugs Bunny versus a 2-hour movie. It's as different as that.
Okay.
So it can make for a lot of ambition and make for a lot of pretension as well, I suppose. So
If I understand, like for me being more of a musician type, it seems like kind of a parallel to the garage band movement. Like there was corporate music kind of took over rock and roll and kind of stole the soul from it. And then this garage band thing happened kind of late 60s, early 70s. And it became, we can do this in our own garage. We can do our own music. We don't have to live with the structure of the corporate. We can begin to experiment and kind of become our own thing. That's, you know, punk rock of the 60s and 70s was kind of born out of that milieu. That kind of idea is like,
I agree.
First we can do this on our own. And it was like, well, not only can we do this on our own, we can kind of blow their structure away and kind of create our own sort of thing. Would that be, you think, an apt parallel, maybe?
I think it would. I mean, one thing that really went on, you're probably familiar with Robert Crumb's work, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
See, one thing that he was involved in, even before the underground comics thing took off, was this thing of fanzines, which was going on before that, right? And they were these homemade, you know, not even comics, they were just these little magazines that people
literally cutting and gluing stuff together to make graphics and stuff. Yeah.
And they sent them around to each other. And that whole DIY thing was sort of the nucleus of underground comics. So that it was already happening, this idea of this DIY approach. So I think that just asserts itself at various times when people, for whatever reason, a lot of energy rises up and people just want to do shit. You know, they're just really excited. And they're a lot more excited by making music, say, in a garage band in whatever limited way they can put it together than they are in learning how to be, you know, professionals. So that's this thing. It's a question of how professional do you want to be, and is that even important? And is the attitude and the energy and all that what's really important? Ultimately, what it'll always come down to is the voice. You know, when I think like garage band, I think of, say, the Ramones. You know, because they, you know, it was partly their persona of being glue sniffing dummies, but they, you know, could play their music as well as they needed to play it, to communicate, and all that stuff. You know, it's always about communication.
Sure.
You know?
And you can also, I guess you could, you know, make the big philosophic jump to what's art and stuff. And what, you know, in art, if you want to look at it as art, then the important thing is expression, the immediacy of the expression.
Absolutely.
And so that lends itself to a more kind of artistic angle versus kind of that corporate product kind of thing.
Right. And that's one thing that's great about comics, which is that, like, you're only limited by your abilities. If you can write a story, if you can draw a story, if you can tell it, if you've got some sense of humor and you can make all that happen, there's nothing holding you back from doing anything and everything you want. I would say that one reason why the graphic novel thing is very exciting to so many people is because, and this is my own experience from having done a couple of them, it's the closest I'll ever get to making a movie. But it's way better than making a movie because there's nobody who can do anything to change it. I get final cut immediately, and I can also get it out there. So as long as you can do that and you have a publisher and you can get it out there, that's better than making a movie, because the movie's going to get destroyed otherwise if you were going to make a movie because of all those constraints.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, Mark had referenced earlier some dudes that we kind of hang out with from England and stuff, and a group within that group are independent filmmakers, and they're kind of doing garage band filmmaking, which is really interesting. They're actually turning out completed films, and they're not professional, but they're not awful. You know, it's viewable. They're making stuff that is at least at a quality level where it's what would you want to call it? Accessible. It's not going to turn people away because it's so kind of raw and new looking. But like I said, even I felt the same way about filmmaking for years. It was something I'm like, oh, I love film, appreciate it. Not something I would ever get involved in because the people I know just all cry and scream about what you just talked about. Like you birth and create this thing, and then you go, we're going to make your vision a reality. It's like, no, they're not. They're going to destroy your child. You won't even recognize it.
Anytime I look into it, and I do like looking into how these guys make these films, it's extraordinary what they have to go through.
Oh, so, unbelievable.
Yeah. Have you been approached about Chartwell Manor to making that into a film?
Early on, yeah, somebody got involved in wanting to do that, and I just gave the whole thing over to Eric Reynolds at Fantagraphics, and let them deal with it. So it's actually early days for that to happen. Even if it does, usually it doesn't happen for quite a while after a graphic novel has been out that it gets made into a movie. The last one I can recall that happened with was My Friend Dahmer by John Backdurf, I think is the name. And
is that the guy that was pen paling with Dahmer?
Well, he knew him in high school.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so he did a book that was, a big hit, but the book was out for 10 years before that movie happened.
Overnight sensation.
Yeah.
Well, it's just how it usually works. And the other one is, what was it called? It's one by Phoebe Gleckner. I forget the name of it, but it's, that one took a long time too, so that it will happen. But, if it happens with my book, great. If it doesn't, I'll be okay with it, because 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work out and it doesn't look like what your book was, and they take all kinds of liberties and change it around. So,
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, I got an opportunity this afternoon to thumb through some of the pages of that I think I looked on Amazon, had a few pages on it. I think the thing in the New York Post had a few pages in it.
Oh, yeah.
I was able to thumb through some of that stuff. First of all, fantastic work. I mean, it just looks and has a feel. I'm encouraged to want to read the whole thing. I want to get the whole thing and read the whole thing, but I'm also a little bit afraid, I think, because of what you're saying, the voice behind it. But I know it's your story, man, is just fantastic. I mean, fantastic in the sense of just it spans so many things, and then reading a little bit about your story, your life, since then, and how you're dealing with that now. And when did you, anyway, that was all my compliment, but my question is, when did you really start to get into drawing and cartooning? And
in fact, if you want to go back to, like, for my money, you can go back to like Young Glenn, Little Glenn. If you want to talk about before what happens in the book, how you found art and how you what growing up was like for you.
Take us on the journey. Take us.
It's all yours.
What happens in the book describes that how I got into it, because I was away at this boarding school, and I was told by a fellow student that the corporal punishment was pretty much unavoidable and it was going to be bad. And I wasn't really aware of that until I was at the school, and I found this out. And what the book shows is young Glenn needing some kind of escape valve, and also hoping to stay safe from the punishment that might come his way by drawing. And the drawing was where he forges enough of an identity that this is what he does with his life. So it's an interesting mixed bag, having been to the school, because on the one hand, the school was very bad. It wasn't actually even really a school. It was just sort of a pedophile's delight. And his whole setup for it was to have a bunch of kids. I should say, though, to you that you shouldn't be too scared by this. I've been happy to see that people that have read this book have not had a problem with it. And I'll tell you, I was worried that they would, because this is dark subject matter.
Right. I think it's more the emotional draw in of these actual events. I think that's just
I'm sure that too, but like,
yeah,
this is dark stuff, and my fear was that it would scare people away. But I've been pleasantly surprised that anybody that picks it up can't put it down and does not have that reaction to it. They can handle it.
Right.
So, and there's nothing gratuitous in it either. It's got some, I guess I'd say, horrific scenes, but I think this is a book that I could honestly say does not go too far. And that's important. Yeah, it's just a way of saying that, like, I think the narrative is strong enough and it pulls you in enough that, like, you won't be dismayed by the subject matter. I say this because this has been the response that everyone's given it. So I've been very happy to see that. It's a personal story, and it's actually very propulsive as a comic book narrative, which is very important to me. See, you know, we were talking about underground comics and autobiography and how, like, see, when I was in art school in the early 80s and studying comics, what was really foisted on us, I felt, that I was not interested in, was autobiography. And the reason was that I found a lot of it dull. And what was very popular at that time, very zeitgeisty, early 80s, was Harvey Pekar, who had, you know, he wrote his comics and he'd have other people, including Crumb, but a lot of other artists, illustrate them. And what he was actually doing was not trying to give you the really intense, dramatic, personal moments. He was more often giving you the day-to-day humdrum life as a file clerk and going to supermarkets and all this kind of stuff. And it's not that I didn't like it, but it didn't grab me, and it wasn't stuff that I really wanted to do. So one thing that kind of had an impact, and that, like, I was like, if I'm gonna tell my story, I really wanted to have a kick to it. You know what I mean? So one of the first things I think when I'm looking to try to do my comics that are autobiographical is, how can I turn this into a movie? You know, like, I really want that thrill of a movie that just pulls you in and won't let you get up to go to the bathroom because you just got to watch this.
Right.
It's good. You know what I mean? And that's what I want. So if I'm going to tell a personal story, I want it to work on that level. I want it to have that kind of propulsion and energy. So I think, you know, I think that's what I look. If I was being asked to pay $25 or whatever for somebody's graphic novel, I wouldn't want my time wasted. I want something cool. I want something fun.
And believe me, I don't think that at all. I'm convinced I'm going to get it and read it just because of you know, I mean, more importantly, it's a story of someone, you specifically, something you went through in life that I'm just like, it's amazing to me to think that, you know, you come out on the end of that. The way it just completely changed you, the way it completely wrecks you, the way it completely later on sets you up for success. I mean, those are the things that are just like, just amazing to me. And just reading the first few pages of it, to me, it was just like, I was drawn in. It had a very cinematic quality to it that brought me to this. I'm visualizing it a little bit more, even better than reading just a regular book. I was able to visualize some of the things you were seeing, the station wagon you're in with your mom when you're talking about, you know, why I have to go back to 7th grade again, you know, those kinds of things kind of drew me in really quickly. I loved it. It was great. So yeah, I'm convinced I'm going to read the whole thing. But again, I think it's that whole emotional thing and the scenes that, you know, are coming that are like, oh, how much worse can it get?
Yeah, it does. But you're right about the emotional aspect, because the time at the boarding school is actually a setup for the rest of the story. And you've got this book with a monster, which is what this pedophile is, but in actual fact, he's a monster in the way that, I don't know, a cobra or some kind of snake or some kind of dangerous reptile is a monster. And that in itself is just not enough. See, so that's not the essence of the story. That's the setup for the story. The story is actually what goes on between me and my parents in terms of whether they will get it, whether they can understand me or not. So that's the essence of what's grappled with in this memoir. It's not so much the headmaster, who, as it turns out, does go to prison, and I couldn't just leave that part of the story hanging. So that does come back later. And there are some of my my classmates post Chartwell, that's the name of the school, and I do get together with them later. But that's not the essence. The essence of it is like, these things affect you, and then what does your life become as a result? How do you deal with them? You know, how do you cope? And so
take us there a little bit. How did
I cope?
Yeah, how did you cope, and to where you are now? Kind of give us that 30,000-foot view.
Okay. Well, the first thing that you do to cope, if you've been through a situation like that, and this is what everybody did, really, as far as I know. Most of the guys I knew, I was friends with. Well, to give you one example, the book is dedicated to my friend from there, a guy named Brian Saradarian. And he's one of the main friends in the book, friend of mine, who explains to me what the corporal punishment is going to be like, because he already knows, because he's already been there.
Okay.
Now, this guy, Brian, who goes by the name of Ryan in the book, he died a while back as a result of lung cancer, probably brought on by smoking crack. Now, I don't know, he was smoking cigarettes the day I met him when he was 12 or 13, but that's where I'm going here. You see, like, there was a level of self-destruction that was going to follow you if you go to a school like this, and was already happening with him when he was there. And he was very, very badly sexually abused. So self-destruction, that's just going to happen. I mean, it happens to the best of us, even if nothing bad has brought it on. There's a kick in driving fast or taking drugs or those other things that I show happening in the book. Some of these things people end up doing regardless, but you're probably really going to do them if you've had some childhood experiences like this. So, you know, so there was, you know, alcohol and drugs and sexual acting out, and they all come with it. So that's the initial phase of coping. The more serious one, of course, is how do you get past that? And when you do get past that, what are you really facing? And of course, what I was really facing was what went on in this book, and ultimately drawing this book. You know, if you look at it, the first page in the book shows my drawing table and a drawing of the headmaster.
Saw that.
So that's telling you what this book is about, is facing that and facing it through this art, through this project that you're holding in your hands by that point. So,
I saw that in the very first page of that, and again, that's one of those moments I felt drawn in, because I had read a little bit about your story, and then reading that or seeing that part, and you standing there, you know, with the beer, chugging it down, throwing another one, and then you're standing there looking at that picture of him, and I knew who that was because I watched some news clips of it without too much said. It was like, that drew me into that. Okay, I see what you're saying now with the setup, because I've not gone much further than that, but now I can see where that's a setup of what's happening.
Right. And
very interesting.
Yeah, and the story circles back to that too, where it's the third chapter in that you go right back to where that character is in that seedy little rooming house apartment, that drawing table. And by that point, you know, that chapter is entitled Dissolution, and it's showing my character sort of spiraling, and at the same time looking into, am I going to draw this stuff, or am I not going to draw this stuff? You know, did he win or will I win? You know.
Ooh.
I'm wondering, because I'm still back here at this other part of the story. So no art interest as a young child in your youth growing up? Like, you're not into art, it's only as a result of this, is like a coping mechanism that you find art, or that art finds you, or however you want to.
No, that's not how I put it. I mean, see, I was saying when I was first doing this art, but that's true. That's when it became like an identity that was forged for me when I was I'd been looking at comics before then, and
so I'm wondering, like, up until we get to this, like, kind of a prequel to how you get to
Sure.
Chartwell Manor, like in your own life. As much as you want to share. I don't want to be prying if I'm stepping
No,
in.
not at all.
I'm just wondering, like, growing up before you got to this point, and what sent you there. What was the mechanism of your life that put you in this place? Just as kind of a prequel.
You know what really grabbed me, and like I would always say that, like the phrase goes, if it ain't personal, it ain't no good, which is a way that I look at a lot of art. If it is,
Yeah.
I'm not going to be interested.
It's got to say something. Sure.
Right. And the thing that's of interest to me that I always think of, the first comic I ever really read, that really grabbed me was Peanuts, and I never read syndicated strips. I never read strips in the newspaper. Or at least, I mean, at a certain point I delivered newspapers, so I would read them, but they weren't a thing, but like,
Right.
I read Peanuts in collected form, in book form.
Right.
And I still think of how devastating emotionally that strip is. All the stuff, that the way those kids deal with each other, the way like Lucy is just basically cruel almost every turn. She's almost never smiling. She's almost never happy.
Vicious.
She's just beating up her younger brother. She's nasty as hell to Charlie Brown. Schroeder, the kid playing the piano, is just this totally self-involved, narcissistic little, musical. I mean,
yeah,
nothing is like, and Snoopy's a little bit just too above it all, almost smug and his dog illness. And so
completely ruined Peanuts.
Schroeder level 2.
Yeah, and Linus has some humanity, but basically, it's a really, really harsh world.
It is.
That was created in that, and it really blew me away as a kid. I mean, I remember being very emotionally affected by that in ways that I don't think I was by practically anything else. And I experienced that initial frustration that I think every cartoonist, I hope, has, which is like, you're trying to copy some other comic that you like, and you can't get it.
Yeah.
And you should be able to do it because, that Charlie Brown head, man, it's really simple. And yet you're trying to do it. And if the mouth and the nose and the eyes aren't just in the right place, you f it up. So I had those experiences early on too of, tearing up the paper and all that. But
yeah, there's something really hard about Charlie Brown. It's
yeah,
not belied. The imagery's so soft and round, and it seems so innocent. And the things that they're saying are so loaded.
Well, it's really rough, man. I mean, it captured childhood for me in a way that nothing I'd seen up to that point had, and maybe hasn't since. I mean,
that dialogue you mentioned, that dialogue between Charlie Brown and Linus, has always reminded me of my inner monologue. It's those two voices. It's that Charlie Brown, I suck, and this Linus going, come on, man, you don't suck. You're just having a bad day.
I know.
The two wolves. That's how that, when I see those two characters together, I'm like, oh, it's the people inside my head. When Charlie, he says, Linus looks at Charlie Brown and says, of all the Charlie Browns in the world, you're the Charlie Browniest. I'm like, it just speaks to me. I'm like, man, I feel like that's how people who know me would describe me. You're the Dougiest Doug there is. It's just you're who you are. I know. I feel what you're saying, man. Yeah, Peanuts is. Peanuts is from another level.
I think like that set me up for a lot of. I don't know, a lot of like.
I think it sets you up for self-realization. I think it makes you comfortable with the idea that you're having an inner monologue. I think a lot of people don't ever interface with that until later in life. And if you're a kid and you can hear Peanuts at that level, you're starting to have a level of self-realization. You're starting to know that you're a person. And I think it's just, it's a way you hear the voice. Like you said, it's a personal thing. I don't know anybody I can think of, Glenn, who's ever said that about Peanuts. And I'm like, yes. So yeah, I think it's just what you started to say was it's got to be personal to be real. It's got to be something that speaks in a voice you understand. Same reason you like a song and this person likes it and that person doesn't. It's because it speaks. It's saying something in my ear that's already resounding in my heart.
It can be personal in all different ways. Like one of the things that we were really forced to look at when I was at SVA in comics, just to like grasp them as a communicative tool was Dick Tracy. And Dick Tracy comics eventually was something that I really studied and really got into. And that's also really disturbing, you know, and in the same way that Peanuts is disturbing, I think Dick Tracy comics are disturbing because they're showing a very dark worldview, I think, in both cases. And, you know, we really had to study the graphics. You know, my work is very involved in black and white. If you look at those pages again, you'll see that like every panel is involved in the balancing of this kind of black and white noir effect that I'm working out. I would actually be lost without it. And I can honestly say I have Art Spiegelman to thank for that, because he would not allow me to work without putting more black into my work. So
that's the magic of comic books, isn't it? That high brilliant contrast.
Well, it's something that, you know, you have to look at from the standpoint of like I'm saying, communicative, but it has to survive the printing process. And that's something that as a cartoonist, you really learn, you know, you face that in a completely different way than somebody who's like a painter, because, you know, people are going to see your work in a gallery. Maybe ultimately it'll be,
they're going to see that painting, not a reproduction.
Yeah, exactly. But like, you're dealing with all kinds of shit that's going to get thrown at you when you're working for reproduction. So, you know, you've got this idea of how your work looks, and then you've got the reality of how it prints, and they can be entirely different animals. You have to come to grips with that and look at it. Yeah. So that's why studying Dick Tracy was really valuable, because that's just really basic. And, you know, the simpler, the better in terms of what you can hope for with a print job. It's not always true, because the blacks also might still suck, but that simplicity may work to your advantage. So,
yeah. So, okay. So going back to the Peanuts and now the Dick Tracy thing, you know, you've given a good you've analyzed those pretty well and kind of pegged each of those characters. What does that say about Schultz? That's it. Schultz. What does that say from your perspective? And, you know, you're an artist, you're drawing the cartoons and putting the story and doing all that stuff. What does that say that you can now see from the artist of Peanut Schultz and now the artist of Dick Tracy? What do you see in them individually? What is personal about that? You see where I'm going with that? What is it you can see in them that that they're dealing with, or I mean, your story is pretty flat out there, you know, in Chartwell Manor, but when you see these dialogues and these narcissistic things in Peanuts and these, you know, overt, you know, prideful attitudes from a dog, what does that say about the artist? What does it say about I'm just curious from your perspective as an artist that way.
Well, I mean, I always have to figure that, like, anytime anybody writes a novel or does a comic and has all these characters in there, that all these characters are parts of that artist's psyche. That seems inescapable, because all those characters are very real in Peanuts. And this is especially true in Dick Tracy, and that's why I found that really fascinating, because like what you've got really amazingly writ large is this id versus the super ego in Dick Tracy. Obviously, Dick Tracy, the character, being the super ego, you know, the square-jawed hero, and this will, you know, the law will win and all this kind of shit. And then you've got these crazy villains that are like just the id run rampant, just crazily. And yeah, so with him, I think he was like a lunatic. And I love that like a lunatic was able to get his comic out there all over the world, and everyone loved it, and it was entertainment. I love the fact that stuff could be seen as entertainment. Yeah. You know? For that matter, frankly, I think it's extraordinary that Schultz did what he did, and that got over as entertainment, because I mean, you know, if that happened these days and somebody did that, people would be flipped out, man. They'd be, the picture of the world being presented would just be way too harsh, you know. It wouldn't be acceptable. So, I mean, that says also something a lot too about what the medium was capable of at that time, you know, with syndicated comics, you know, that there wasn't that much censoring or whatever it was. And I mean, you know, eventually newspaper comics just became a vehicle for, you know, trademarking your character and selling it like crazy. And it's not that Schultz didn't go in for that too, but that wasn't the essence of what he was doing. it was a great comic. What he was
Right.
Yeah.
So what sends you off to this Chartwell Manor? What's the story? As much as you want to share, no spoiler alerts or anything. Like I said, as much or little detail as you want to share here, just for those who are listening and considering purchasing the book. What can you kind of set it up? I guess would be.
So the question is why did I end up at that school in the first place?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Probably for a similar reason to why a lot of kids did. I wasn't doing well in school. I was kind of acting up a little bit. I wasn't like a juvenile delinquent, but I was sort of a wannabe, you know, so that by the time I actually got to the school, I was hanging out with these kids, like the one I mentioned who died from crack smoking, probably.
Right.
But it's just one of these things where like school back then was actually kind of like almost like a sewer system. Where like
I'm guessing, and I'm just going to ask you, urban setting here, right? Northern New Jersey. I'm assuming you're in a fairly populated place, probably pretty large school system.
Suburban, yeah.
Okay, guess of like how big of a school, if you had a guess. If not.
But
I'm detail guy. I
CHARTWELL Manor or the
no. You're like where you went to school before you went there.
Well, I was at some junior high school in Madison, which is part of the sewer system where they just push all the kids together who've been in all the other public schools, and things weren't going well there. And so it's kind of like the other thing you have to factor in all this is that this was going on in the early 70s.
Understand.
And it's very important to remember that like child abuse didn't exist yet. By that, I mean, not in a collective.
Right. No notoriety for it. It was a hush hush.
It didn't exist. It was like, you know, it just didn't exist. So there was no real way to discuss it, no way to discuss it with your parents. And that's very important because when things, as you know, are kept in the dark, that's when the real bad shit can happen. And it did. But in terms of what led to it, it was really very simple that there was another mom in my hometown whose kid had been sent away to this place. And this mom recommended it to my mom. And the next thing I know, there's an interview that happens, an intake type thing. And this also factors in. I had this paper route that I mentioned earlier, and I had been saving up to buy a motorcycle. Now, I was only going to be allowed to have one. If
you did want to be troublemaker, didn't you?
You know, it's just fun. But this school allowed motorcycles, and if my grades were up, I could get one. So it's a confluence of events that led to that kind of thing happening.
Perfect storm.
Yeah, I guess you could say that, you know.
Okay, so and there was like no lead up to this. Like if you don't straighten up, we're just like all of a sudden.
Yeah, I wasn't that much of a bad kid, actually. You know, I got in fights like a lot of kids did, but you know, it's just like a lot of things in life, just bad luck, you know.
The Gentlementor.